5.5 years ago, I nearly lost my life and ended up losing 7 of my fingertips and both of my lower legs because of a small infection on my thumb. The infection was purple and swollen, was oozing a little bit of fluid, and it looked a little bit unusual, so I decided to go into an emergency clinic to make sure that it was nothing serious. They took a culture and told me that it would be 3 to 4 days before they got results back, so they gave me an antibiotic ointment that I should begin using immediately and gave me antibiotics to start taking over the weekend if things got worse. They felt comfortable sending me home because they checked my vital signs, and my heart rate, breathing rate, and blood pressure, and even my temperature were normal, so there was no indication that the infection had spread throughout my body. I picked up a thermometer on the way home when I got the antibiotics because I believed that if I checked my temperature, it would indicate if I was becoming sick because of the infection. I later learned you don't need to have a fever to be deathly ill. Did I mention that I was home alone? I began using the antibiotic ointment on Friday night, and I know that I was taking my temperature because I thought that if I had a fever, it would indicate that I was becoming sick and I should probably go to the hospital. Saturday morning, the infection was getting worse, so I started taking the antibiotics. I know this not because I remember it, because I don't have memories of the weekend, but because I texted my husband, who was away on a fishing trip in Idaho, and I told him that I had thrown up because I'd taken this antibiotic. He wouldn't get that message till much later in the day, and at that point I texted him back and said I was too tired to talk on the phone and told him I'd talk to him on Sunday morning. Most likely at this point I was already becoming septic. I was getting sick, and that's why I was throwing up. I was also extremely tired and later learned that I had fallen at some point and I had broken one of my feet and I had sprained the other and I had abrasions on my knee. But I crawled right back into bed, and that was a clear sign of mental decline, which is one of the very serious symptoms of sepsis. On Sunday morning, I never did end up talking to Scott. Instead, I texted a friend at 6 a.m. in the morning at the crack of dawn and said, "Can you please take me to the hospital? I have never been so sick." She was shocked to get a call so early in the morning and immediately came to my house, where she found me nearly unresponsive in my bed. She was able to wake me up, but I couldn't walk. So she had me sit down on the floor and slide across on a blanket and got me downstairs to her truck so that she could take me to the hospital. We both knew it didn't make sense to call an ambulance because the ambulances are 20 minutes closer to the hospital and the hospital was over an hour away. So she knew if she needed one, she could call on the way. On top of that, I couldn't believe that I could possibly be this sick and figured I was just dehydrated, so I kept telling her I was fine and that I didn't need an ambulance. She drove as fast as she could, and about 10 minutes out from the hospital, I started crying in the back seat, saying my hands and feet are on fire. She knew this wasn't the flu and called ahead and asked him to meet us at the emergency room with a gurney. We were met at the emergency department with a gurney, and I was taken inside, where they realized that my blood pressure was 50/30. That's critically low. I was also crying and complaining about the pain in my hands and feet, so that combined with my blood pressure made them start to suspect that I might be in septic shock. I was so fortunate that the hospital I was in had a sepsis protocol. They immediately drew blood and checked it to find out what pathogen was making me sick. They gave me antibiotics and fluids, and they put me on oxygen to help me breathe better. Because they acted so quickly, it's part of the reason I'm alive today. My friend who was with me began calling my family and could only reach my daughter, who was just 23 years old at the time that this happened. Her dad was out fishing on a river in Idaho and she couldn't reach him, so she had to be the head of our family throughout that day. My blood tests showed all the indicators that I was in septic shock. To make matters worse, my hands and feet began to turn purple. After arriving at the emergency room in septic shock, my kidneys and my lungs began to fail. My doctors also suspected that I had a very serious secondary condition called DIC, or disseminated intravascular coagulation, where I was having clotting in my hands and feet, in my capillaries, cutting off circulation to my fingers and my toes, and then eventually it would also affect my hands and my feet. They needed to transport me from Kauai, where I was located, over to Oahu to the Level 1 Trauma Center in Honolulu. My daughter had been able to reach my husband the evening before, and he had spent the whole night driving to Salt Lake City from Idaho and had caught a plane and was flying to Honolulu in hopes that he would meet me there. With my husband out of reach, my sister-in-law, who's a doctor, was consulting with me and my doctors. At her request, I signed paperwork that allowed them to put a tube down my throat so that it would breathe for me and put me into a drug-induced coma so that I would be safe for the transport over to Oahu. After I was intubated and put into a drug-induced coma, I was taken by ambulance and then by airplane over to Oahu, where I met my husband at Queens Medical Center. He's told me that when he saw me, I was unrecognizable because of all the fluids in my body. And with the mechanical breathing device, he said it looked like I had already died. He was horrified and unprepared for what he saw. He talked to the doctors and asked how I was doing, and they just said, "Sit down, she's not stable. We're going to take her into the ICU and we'll get back to you." When they came out, they said, "I'm so sorry, but your wife is very sick. If you have children or other family, they should come and be by her side because we're not sure she's going to make it through the night." My husband called my 2 daughters in California and told them that they should come and be with me. And at that point, he didn't tell them that he wasn't sure I was going to survive, but he said they needed to get there as quickly as possible. I think they knew that I was in very serious condition. Having lived in Hawaii for the past 10 years with our family on the mainland, I'd often thought about how horrible it would be if, like, one of my parents or my grandparents died and I had to travel across the ocean to be with them. And here were my children making that same trip the opposite direction, being on an airplane for 5 or 6 hours before they were able to be with family, knowing that I might not survive. He then called my sister-in-law, and I think he was looking for some reassurance. And when she found out that I had DIC, she said she was getting on a plane and she'd be there in the morning. The doctors were back in the ICU with me, and at that point he realized that I truly may not survive. Despite less than a 1% chance of survival, I made it through that night. I spent the next 5 days in the ICU in a coma with the ventilator breathing for me. My family was by my side as they watched my fingertips turn from purple to black and watched the purple spread down my fingers all the way down to my wrists and from my toes all the way to my ankles. Everyone was trying to hold out hope that even with this discoloration, they might be able to save my hands and feet, but my husband finally took the doctors aside and said, "Please tell us what we can expect." I think at this point he thought I was out of the woods, but the doctor said, "Well, if she does survive, you need to start preparing yourself that she may not have hands and feet." As horrible as that was to hear, they knew that I would just want to survive. I'd always looked forward to having grandchildren one day, and they knew that I'd want to be there even without hands and feet, so they just prayed that I would survive. I am now at Queens Hospital, and I have woken up from a coma, and my hands have gone in front of my face, and I realize I'm going to lose my fingertips, and I am overwhelmed, as depressed as I've ever been in my life, but I'm also experiencing probably swelling in my brain still and some delirium that went on for an entire week where I was extremely confused, thinking my nightmares were reality, and I just didn't know what was going on. I didn't know up from down. My family did testing to ensure that I didn't have any trauma to my brain, and my brain was fine, and I actually did eventually on the 7th or 8th day started acting like my normal self again. So they realized that I did not have brain damage, which was a huge relief to them. But now I have mental clarity, and now I'm really aware of the fact that my fingertips have died, and I also realize that my feet are also very, very dark purple, and my hands are dark purple. And so my doctors make it clear to me that we're going to do everything that we can to try and save my hands. That included treatments with painful nitroglycerin cream that was put on 4 times a day. Whether I was awake or not, they would just wake me up and do it. And it was, I think, about, a half hour or so. I can still remember it as being extremely painful on my hands and feet. And then I also went into hyperbaric chambers, where you go into a pressurized chamber. It's almost like diving. When you dive underwater, it causes pressure to build up in the chamber. They lock it and they basically draw the air out of it, and they pump oxygen in. It hyperoxygenates your body, and it wasn't as much for my lungs as it was for the wounds on my body, and they were hoping that I would take in oxygen and that this pressure would help it get into my body, into the places that it was needed, specifically my feet and my hands. If you're a doctor, please feel free to give more information about hyperbarics, because it's really fascinating and amazing for wound healing. After 3 weeks of me being alert, I finally realized that my hands were fine. We had saved almost all of my hands. Everything that was light purple or red had turned back to this natural color, and I only lost the tips of my fingers. However, we were not able to save my feet. And I finally just started crying one day as I was going into the hyperbaric chamber and said, "I don't want to do this anymore. I know we can't save my feet." We had been airlifted from Kauai, where I was living, over to Honolulu, and that's where I spent time in the ICU, and that's where all this was happening. But we didn't have friends and family there, so it was decided that we would move back to Seattle, which is where we had lived 10 years prior. And we had a better base of people there. We knew hundreds of people from our earlier life there. We had gone to college there, and we had family in Washington State that could be much closer to us. And I also felt more comfortable going to a really big hospital. I knew that at Harborview in Seattle had done a lot of amputations, because unfortunately people get in accidents and motorcycles and things like that. So it's just a regular part of what they do, which is a little bit less common in a small place like Hawaii. Up to that point in my life, I had been extremely healthy. I'd never had any health conditions. I was athletic. I used my body very regularly in my day-to-day things, and I was really healthy, which is lucky because I'm sure that that's the only reason I survived. The odds were very much against me. Obviously, this is a horrible thing to happen to anyone, no matter what the circumstances are. So I had to come to terms with the fact that I was going to lose my feet, but we were able, during that 3-week period after I woke up in the hospital, we were able to save my hands. And all I ended up losing were my fingertips. We flew from Honolulu, which is where I was at the time, to Seattle, where we had lived 10 years prior. And we were welcomed back into that city in an absolutely amazing way. After 5 weeks in the hospital, we went straight to Harborview Hospital. I haven't mentioned that I was on such a big cocktail of antibiotics for this whole time that I hadn't been able to keep food down. It was passing through my body, I'll just say it that way. I ended up losing about 25% of my body weight. I was extremely malnourished, according to the nutritionist, and I was really weak. So we spent the first few days in the hospital trying to get my strength up so that I would be ready for the surgery that I would have to have, which was, by my choice, it was just the removal of my feet. I couldn't imagine doing my hands and feet at the same time, so I opted to keep my hands the way they were. I'd gotten kind of used to it, even though that's kind of gross, but they didn't hurt really bad, and I just didn't want to have that surgery quite yet. So going into that surgery was the hardest thing I've ever done. However, I had no choice. I had to do it. So it was just a matter of going with the flow, just sort of looking at my day as I was getting ready and just going from task to task. I got up and brushed my teeth. I did the things that I was being told that I had to do to prepare for the surgery. And then I really focused on those little details so that I didn't have to think about the surgery. When I got into the surgery room, I asked one of the nurses if they could hide the instruments because I'd talked to somebody during this time, another amputee, who said that they saw the implements that were used or instruments. I didn't want that to happen, and so I asked them if they would please cover them, and she said that she would. And then I also asked a doctor, and this is something anyone can do, when I was talking to the anesthesiologist, I asked him if they would put me out immediately. And honestly, that's the last thing I remember saying. Next thing I remember is waking up. And at this point, I just was relieved, thinking, okay, this is behind me. Now I just have to get through the next, period of recovery. I know it's going to be painful, but I can quit dreading the loss of my feet. It's been done, and now I just have to come to terms with it. I'm not going to lie. The next week was pretty excruciating, but I'm not the first person to have a difficult surgery. So anyone who's been through it knows it can be really difficult. It's sometimes hard to get on top of the meds. I had a couple little complications, but no infections, which was very important. And after a week, I was able to go home and be with my family again. And it was Halloween Eve. So I went home during a holiday, and it sort of was the kickoff of the holiday season. And it was honestly a really nice time for me to recover.